Let's start with something that needs to be said clearly before we get into the details, because it is the kind of statement that cuts through all the noise and gets to the heart of what is actually at stake in this conflict. Iran has been here for millennia. The people of that region, Persian, Arab, Kurdish, all of them have been there for thousands of years. No political actor, no military campaign, no combination of the two is going to erase them from the map. Total annihilation is not a viable strategic objective. It never was. These peoples will continue to exist. They will continue to share that region. They will be neighbors for as long as humanity continues. And eventually, whether it takes months or years or decades, the parties involved will have to find a way to coexist. That is not an opinion. That is geography and history operating on a timeline that makes any individual political administration look temporary by comparison. That framing matters enormously for what we are about to discuss, because the country that just said those words publicly and acted on them is Qatar, and the implications of Qatar's decision are far more significant than most of the coverage is letting on. If you want to follow developments like this in real time with the depth and context they deserve, subscribe to From Report right now. This is the kind of story we were built for. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this with anyone in your network who is paying serious attention to what is happening in the Middle East. Let's establish what has just happened, because the headline does not fully capture the weight of it. Qatar has officially announced its withdrawal from its role as mediator in the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. The Qatari government communicated this formally, not through back channels, not through hints and suggestions, but through an official diplomatic statement. They are done. They do not want to be part of this. They do not want Washington pulling them further into a conflict whose direction and consequences they no longer believe in. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a routine diplomatic adjustment, a small Gulf state deciding to step back from a complicated mediation role. But to read it that way would be to fundamentally misunderstand what Qatar represented in this conflict and what its withdrawal actually means. Since the escalation between the United States, Israel, and Iran began, Qatar was the only functional communication channel between the two sides. The only one, not the United Nations, not the European Union, not any of the G7 nations, Qatar. Doha was the city where messages passed between Washington and Tehran. Qatari officials had direct access to the Iranian leadership. They maintained open lines to the White House. They occupied a position of extraordinary diplomatic leverage, simultaneously hosting the largest American military base in the entire Middle East and serving as Iran's primary conduit to the Western world. That is a balance that requires extraordinary skill to maintain, and Qatar had maintained it against all odds for years. That entire diplomatic architecture just collapsed, and understanding why it collapsed requires going back further than this week. What Qatar experienced over the past year and a half is a lesson in what happens when you serve as a good faith mediator between parties that are not acting in good faith. Here is what needs to be understood about the dynamic that finally broke Qatar's patience. Last year, Israel communicated through Qatari channels that it was ready to negotiate a peace agreement with Palestinian representatives. The message was clear. Send the Hamas delegation to Qatar. We are prepared to sign a deal. End this conflict through negotiation. Qatar, acting in its role as honest broker, facilitated exactly that. The Hamas delegation traveled to Doha on the promise of peace talks. Israel bombed the meeting, not the building before or after the meeting. It killed not only members of the Hamas delegation, figures Israel had been unable to locate and eliminate through conventional military operations, but also Qatari diplomats, people who were there precisely because they believed in the process of negotiation, people who died because they trusted that the invitation was genuine. The fact that Qatar continued serving as a mediator after that incident was remarkable. It spoke to either extraordinary pragmatism, extraordinary patience, or both. But it also established a pattern, and patterns matter in diplomacy because they tell you who you are actually dealing with. That pattern repeated itself on February 28th. The day before the strikes that killed the supreme leader and triggered this entire conflict, an Iranian delegation was in Oman, meeting with American representatives. They had accepted, according to reports from multiple sources, essentially everything Washington had asked for as preconditions for a peace agreement. The framework was there. The signatures were being prepared. The narrative on the Friday was that peace in the Middle East was hours away from being formalized. The next morning, the bombs fell. The supreme leader was killed. A primary school was struck, killing 175 Iranian girls, and the peace framework that had supposedly been hours from completion was revealed to have been at minimum a diplomatic cover for a military operation that was already planned and already in motion. Qatar watched that happen from the inside as the country that had been facilitating the communication, as the country whose role as honest broker depended entirely on both sides believing that the mediation process was genuine. Qatar was used and they knew it. This is why the Qatari withdrawal is not simply a diplomatic inconvenience for Washington. It is a fundamental indictment of how the United States and Israel have conducted this conflict. What Qatar is saying in careful, measured diplomatic language is that the framework for this war is one they cannot legitimately participate in. When they say that Iran has been in the region for thousands of years and is not going anywhere, they are not making a historical observation, they are making a political statement. They are saying the objective that appears to be driving this military campaign, the idea that Iran can be dismantled, destabilized, or fundamentally transformed through aerial bombardment, is not a realistic objective, and we are not going to continue lending our credibility to a process built around an unrealistic objective. When they say that coexistence is the only long-term option, they are explicitly rejecting the logic of the war, and when they say they want no further involvement, they are drawing a line between themselves and Washington that would have been unthinkable even a few months ago. To understand the full significance of that line, consider what Qatar was willing to tolerate before drawing it. They hosted the largest American military base in the Middle East, while simultaneously maintaining diplomatic relations with Iran. They served as mediator after Israeli strikes killed Qatari diplomats on their own territory. They continued facilitating communications after the February 28 strikes that turned out to have been launched while negotiations were supposedly ongoing. Qatar absorbed an extraordinary amount before reaching this point. The fact that they have now reached it tells you something important about how much the relationship has deteriorated, and Qatar is not alone. This is the part of the story that deserves the most attention and the part that is receiving the least. Iraq effectively ended its cooperation with Washington earlier this week, a development we covered in depth on From Report that represents one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in the region in decades. Now Qatar, the Arab League, which was already struggling to maintain a coherent position on this conflict, is watching its member states peel away from the American coalition one by one. The only major Arab state that remains fully aligned with Washington at this point is Saudi Arabia, and it is worth being precise about what that alignment looks like and why it exists. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the same figure accused of ordering the assassination and dismemberment of a journalist inside a diplomatic consulate, is, according to reporting from the New York Times, the only regional leader actively pushing Washington to continue the war. Not supporting it reluctantly, actively encouraging it, that is who remains as America's Arab partner in this conflict. Every other significant Arab state is stepping back, going quiet, or doing what Qatar just did and making their position formally explicit. What this means strategically is profound. The United States entered this conflict with at least the nominal support of a Gulf coalition. It is now watching that coalition dissolve in real time, while simultaneously dealing with base degradation in the region, personnel evacuated to European hotels, and an adversary that just launched its 84th wave of retaliatory strikes. The political geography of the Middle East is shifting against Washington faster than any single military development in the conflict itself. Let's go deeper on what Qatar's specific role meant, because the coverage tends to treat it as a symbolic loss rather than a functional one, and that misses the point entirely. Qatar was not just a neutral party lending its good offices to the process. Qatar was the infrastructure of the diplomatic channel. When Thron wanted to communicate something to Washington without the provocation of direct contact, it went through Doha. When Washington wanted to test Iranian reactions to specific proposals without formal engagement, it used the Qatari connection. When both sides needed to pull back from an escalation without publicly acknowledging the de-escalation, Qatar was the mechanism that made that possible. Remove Qatar and you do not simply lose a mediator, you lose the entire functional pathway through which an off-ramp could be constructed. You lose the early warning system that could signal when one side was approaching a red line before crossing it. You lose the credibility buffer that allowed both parties to explore compromise positions without appearing to show weakness to their domestic audiences. What replaces Qatar in that role? Currently, nothing. The European powers were already marginalized in this process. They simply did not have the access or the relationships that Qatar had built over years. The UN is structurally incapable of filling the gap in the time frame this conflict demands, and Oman, which had served as another back-channel conduit, is watching what happened to Qatar and drawing its own conclusions about the risks of that role. The diplomatic space in this conflict has not just narrowed, it has collapsed. And it has collapsed because the parties that destroyed the trust on which that space depended, by negotiating while planning strikes, by bombing mediators, by launching attacks, while peace frameworks were supposedly hours from signature, have now lost the good faith partners that were the only reason any diplomatic space existed in the first place. There is a deeper pattern here that goes beyond this specific conflict, and it deserves to be named clearly because it has implications that extend far beyond the Strait of Hormuz. The model that has been applied in this conflict: invite the other side to negotiate, use the negotiation to gather intelligence and lower their defenses, then strike, is not a new invention. New, it has a history in this region that the regional actors know intimately. The Hamas delegation in Qatar last year, the Iranian delegation in Oman on February 27th, both followed the same template, both produced the same outcome, both left the facilitating parties holding the consequences. What this model destroys is not just a specific diplomatic process, it destroys the credibility of American diplomacy across the entire region for years to come, because every government in the Middle East that is watching this, and they are all watching this, is now running the same calculation. If we agree to mediate, facilitate, or participate in an American-led diplomatic process, what guarantee do we have that the process itself is genuine? What assurance exists that the invitation to negotiate is not itself a targeting mechanism? The answer, after what Qatar witnessed and what Iran experienced, is none. There is no assurance, and in the absence of assurance, governments do what Qatar just did. They step back. They protect their sovereignty, their credibility, and their people. They decline to be instruments of a process they no longer trust. Qatar also made a point that should not be lost in the geopolitical analysis, a point about the long-term arithmetic of this region that is more honest than anything being said in Washington or Tel Aviv right now. Iran is a civilization more ancient than the concept of the United States itself. The Persian people were building empires, writing poetry, practicing medicine, and mapping the stars. While the continent of North America was unknown to the Western world, that is not a political statement in favor of any particular Iranian government or policy. It is a fact of history, and the fact has a practical implication. Whatever happens in this conflict, whatever its outcome, Iran as a nation, as a people, as a civilization, will continue to exist. The 90 million people who live in that country are not going to disappear because of American airstrikes or Israeli military campaigns. Qatar understands this. The rest of the Arab League understands this. It is increasingly the view of much of the global South, and it is the view that Washington and Tel Aviv appear to be the last to accept, which is precisely why their political strategy in this conflict has been built around assumptions that the rest of the world stopped sharing a long time ago. So where does this leave us as we close out this week and move into the next phase of the conflict? The United States is now fighting a war in the Middle East with degraded basing, evacuated personnel, a fracturing alliance with Israel, a collapsed mediation channel, and a regional coalition that is peeling away one country at a time. Qatar's withdrawal is not the end of that process. It is a milestone in a trajectory that began with Iraq and will continue as other regional actors make similar calculations about the cost of remaining associated with a conflict whose direction and legitimacy they no longer believe in. The irony, and it is a profound one, is that Qatar's statement could have been written in Washington by anyone who had thought honestly about the long-term dynamics of this region. You cannot erase Iran. You cannot bomb a civilization into submission. You will share this geography for the rest of human history. The question was never whether coexistence was necessary. The question was only how much destruction would occur before that reality was accepted. Qatar just stopped pretending the answer to that question was anything other than what it obviously is, and in doing so they have left Washington more diplomatically isolated in the Middle East than at any point since this conflict began. We are going to keep tracking every dimension of this story on From Report: the military developments, the diplomatic shifts, the economic fallout, and the geopolitical realignments that most outlets are only beginning to notice. Subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video with anyone who is serious about understanding what is really happening in this region, and join us live Monday through Friday. The mainstream media gives you the official version. We give you the full picture. We will see you in the next one.